Monday at 4:30. I will reinforce a lot of this stuff. Again, it is perhaps unfortunate that so much happens so late in Earth history, but it's important to keep things in a timeline sense. You'll notice I don't go back and forth. I basically do things chronologically, and when you do things chronologically, you end up seeing an awful lot at the moment. And all things you should know about. And probably because of that, psychologically, I tend to, if anything, maybe overemphasize it on the test. But I want to make sure people are still hanging in there at the end because there's a lot of interest in this last part of our system. So I have about 2 things left to do. First is to say a little bit about Neogene life. What was the life going on during all this time of tectonic ferment when the Red Sea was opening while the Mediterranean dried up, that the tectonics of the western U.S. was all bashing around. What was going on in the history of life? And it might surprise you that despite all this tectonic activity and so on, there really weren't major mass extinctions. In spite of this, there was a minor mass extinction in the early Miocene, maybe associated with the big volcanics. But apparently, the magnitude of these events, as big as they seem to us, were not so big that it caused huge problems. If there's a 6th mass extinction, where's the cause of it? And we'll get to that momentarily. So we have to finish the Neogene life and then pass to the last chapter of Earth's history, which is Quaternary, the last couple of million years. All right, so you can see an unprecedented rise of biodiversity during this time. And if you look at, it doesn't show much about marine life, but marine life, actually, flip it up just for a minute. You see it beautifully along the Atlantic coastal plains. So you've got these Neogene beds full of shells. This is again near Calvert Cliffs in Maryland. You see shell beds like this, just full of clams and snails. There's a weathered out outcrop. And go down to the coastal plains and you can gather up these things just like collecting modern shells almost there. Some of them even still have their colors. So they haven't been altered very much, original or abnormal. And of course what people go after is the great Cachargon, Cacharocles teeth, and I didn't know where Austin is, like always, but he went there at my bidding, and I told him some good localities and got some shark teeth from some friends of mine down there in in this case in the Carolinas. There are also crustaceans living in these seas. It's a nice place to see crab. Okay, yeah, I'm going to put it down. So, just some things. And in the Great Salisbury Embayment, i.e. the Chesapeake Bay area, which had been created in the Eocene as an asteroid impact, there was a calving ground for whales, and part of the reason for so many giant sharks there was probably just that. There are lots of ones. There's the comparison of those shark teeth in place in the reconstructed jaw versus the modern great white. So you can see there are the largest sharks that ever lived in the Miocene. Now, if you go to the Neogene on land, and this is the same, then turn it back on, and we'll save that as much as we can. You see a landscape dominated by a more seasonal type climate. I think that the artist was kind of being a little symbolic here, showing fall colors here. And in a world of Western North America, where you have horses that have the full developed single toes and all that, some elephant relatives, but also weird things like Synthetosaurus, which had a slingshot horn on its nose. These are all living in camels out here, or llamas. So what can we say about the terrestrial ecosystem of the time? We always call it the later part of the age of mammals, or we think of it as the age of humans. But, there are a lot of other things you could say. It's the age of C4 plants. Now, C4 plants, I don't have time to get into the specifics, but they have a different pathway of photosynthesis, which helps them to conserve water and helps them to work during times of dry, hot climates, or hot maybe is too extreme. Warmer, drier climates that existed in the Miocene. You'll recall, again, that there was a Messinian time in the Miocene when the climate became rather dry in the Mediterranean area. It dried up. And probably these plants evolved in response to this climatic shift. They are more efficient under some conditions than C3 plants. They include a lot of grasses, corn, and many other things, sugarcane. A lot of our important crop plants are there. They also secrete silica in their tissues. And this means that they're quite hard to grind, and this is probably related, and this is a question I've asked year after year on the test, related to the rise of horses with high crown molar teeth, of cattle and antelopes and others with high crown teeth, because they're having to cope with this new type of vegetation. It didn't cause extinction, but maybe yes. Maybe some of the big brontotheres, those big giant rhino-like things, they never developed the high crown teeth, and perhaps they were a victim of this. Anyway, once you have these, you have a lot more seeds. You have more seeds, you have more insects, more rodents, and other things. So we can say it's not only is the age of C4 plants, which, by the way, can be recorded even in the carbon isotopes of terrestrial sediment. You see a sudden shift that relates to this new photosynthetic pathway. But you see that insects were doing just great during this time. This is Diptera, these are the flies. You can take them back into Jurassic time, but they really expand during the later Cenozoic. So do lepidopterans, those are butterflies and moths, they're pollinators, co-evolving with these C4, which by the way, of course, are angiosperms. And the Hymenoptera, these are bees and wasps and so on. So, you know, there's unprecedented diversity of insects. So you can call it the age of insects if you're an entomologist. But you can also say that there's the age of grasses, you know, C4 grasses, herbs and weeds, insects. And once you have seeds and insects around, you're going to have things to feed on. The rise of mice and rats, of course, amongst the mammals and rodents really proliferated during this time. And so do songbirds. The first songbirds are Neogene, the little bluebird, but most of the birds you think about in your garden, they are a product of Neogene evolution. You didn't have many Tweety birds prior to the Neogene, but they're coming in along with a wave of insects, a wave of seeds, and other types of reproductive structures produced by these plants, which gives a huge new food supply. If you got birds and mice and rats around, you're also going to have things like predators, like snakes. So some would call it the age of snakes, or maybe the age of frogs, because lots of frogs evolved in response to all the insects, and then snakes evolved in response to the frog, to the mice, and so on. So it's the age of, you know, the age of C4 plants, the age of weeds, the age of mice, the age of songbirds, the age of snakes, the age of frogs, but we think of it as the age of mammals. Birds, by the way, outnumber mammals 2 to 1, so we shouldn't ignore them as an important part of our terrestrial ecosystem. There's a lot of new evolution of birds that occurred in the Neogene. The later part of the age of mammals, the age of anthropoids, that might be a good way of putting it. Of course, much of the main diversification occurred during not the Neogene, but back in the Paleogene time, in the early Cenozoic. But now various groups really take off. Probably the even-toed ungulates start to overshadow the odd-toed as huge new groups of cattle, sheep, giraffe, pig, and other representatives of that group that come along. Rodents really expand, as I already mentioned. The lagomorphs, which are a sister group, the rabbits, also expand in this time. Elephants do a lot of interesting things. And of course, primates. Here's an interesting thing. This is a Neogene beaver burrow called Demonalex. It's this huge corkscrew, some left hand, some right hand. They're made by beavers. Horses, as I mentioned before, make it pretty well in the Miocene time. Have some cutback as we go into the Pliocene, and then luckily ran off to Asia and Africa. They lived in North America right up to the Pleistocene, into the Pleistocene, in the Quaternary, and they even made it into South America, but for some reason, horses became extinct over this entire region and only survived in the Old World. But they came through the Bering Land Bridge from North America, and they made it down eventually into Africa and parts of Asia, where they survived and even diversified during later time. Yep, some weird things lived in our western states at that time. This is a bear dog, relative to sort of the bear, but more dog-like in some ways, attacking a Synthetosaurus, one of these weird guys, distant relative of the pronghorn, with this very strange slingshot. The elephants came out of Africa, and they expanded during the Neogene, including the Dinotheres, which had this downturned lower jaw, probably for tearing up stuff. Some of them had shovel-like teeth. Some had these kind of down-curved tusks on the bottom jaw here, quite different from modern elephants, which have the upper tusks. And these shovel tusks were really quite weirdly adapted. They had a flattened trunk and a big expanded jaw. So, yeah, again, they came out of Africa. They expanded in various directions into Asia, crossed the Bering Land Strait into North America, just the opposite of horses, which went the other way. and then you made it all the way down through the Isthmus of Panama, which had been produced about 3 million years ago, and there were finally some gomphotheres way down in South America. So spreading out of Africa and down, of course, this famous corridor, which was created by volcanism during the Pliocene time, later Neogene. Now, a very important part of the story, obviously, is going to be what was going on in the primates. This is, I showed before, this is a very early primate, probably a prosimian related to modern lemurs. They did not evolve in Africa, not like elephants. These things evolved in North America. And about 55, 58 million years ago, these things were in the western basins, near the uplifts of the Laramide and so on, and they were buried in the sediments out there. So we have a pretty good skeletal record of very early primates there. They may even go into Cretaceous time. They crossed probably the famous Paleozoic extinction. Egyptopithecus, I showed before, 35 million years, the first catarrhine primate, or one of the early ones, which gave rise to the rest of monkeys and apes. And again, I already mentioned this, but just to remind, there was the split between the new and old world monkeys. I'm only going to focus on the old world from here on out. These evolved their own little way with special prehensile tails and so on. The only prehensile, I don't know what it is about the new world that had several groups with prehensile tails, but it wasn't just the monkeys. But the only old world animal that ever had a prehensile tail was bear cat, interestingly enough, which is a not a monkey, it's a cat dog, or a weasel dog. Anyway, yeah. In the old world, on the other hand, there were brachiators, which went in for arm swinging, and they were arboreal. Things by about 18 million years, the ancestors of the gibbons, which were in turn the sort of sister group to the great family, the Hominidae. The Hominidae, it doesn't just anymore include hominines, which are humans, but it includes the pangines, which are today constricted to parts of Southeast Asia and on the way out, I'm afraid, the famed orangutans. And then the great apes and hominids, which include the gorilla, chimps, and humans, that seem to share a common ancestor somewhere about 18 million years ago. That would be during the famous Miocene epoch, which was a long chunk of the Neogene. Sahelanthropus is one of the very early things which is kind of maybe close to the common ancestor of chimps and humans. And this is in Chad in Africa, and about 6 or 7 million years ago. There were others too, and I'm not going to get into all of them, but just to mention, there was Orrorin, which is only known from fragments from Kenya, and it's also sort of along the line towards the hominines. And again, the hominines are our group here that includes not just the humans, but also chimps and gorillas. The record of the chimps and gorillas is very poor, but luckily for us, the record of the human side of the family is pretty good. We do see a very critical development somewhere in around 4.5 million years ago. Ardipithecus. Ardipithecus was an animal which was very close to the split point between chimps and humans. It was predicted by molecular clock. If you know what that is, don't worry about it. It's a biological technique. It had to be about 5 million years, and it ended up that people found fossils just a few years ago in Africa that do show about what they expected. That this is about the time of deviation from chimps and great apes to the more human side of the hominine subfamily. This is a subfamily. So from there comes what is sometimes now called Prey-anthropus or Australopithecus. It's originally Australopithecus anamensis, and most famous of all fossils, maybe except for Archaeopteryx, I guess, but probably the second most famous is Lucy. And Lucy is coming in right around 3.9 and going up to about 2.7 million years ago, or maybe a little bit later. It is the so-called Afarensis, Prey-anthropus afarensis, named for the Afar Triangle, where that big split of the Arabian subcontinent was beginning to take place, even in these days. And the reason the excellent fossil record is we have a lot of volcanoplastic sediments in the East African Rift Valley that has helped to preserve the record of these things. And there she is in all her glory. Lucy named for a Beatles song, as you all know, but this was found by Donald Johanson let's say the late 1970s, so it's a while ago. I thought it was a very big deal when Lucy was found with a nearly complete skeleton from the Afar region of Ethiopia. You see an organism which was about 4 feet tall, something like this, 1.2 meters, bipedal. That's an important thing. The hip sockets show that she, that whole group, was upright walking, was not arboreal, and in fact, probably the drying out of the Miocene had helped to trigger an evolution coming out of the trees and into an upright walking primate. Her brain capacity, on the other hand, was still not impressive compared to modern humans. With a 500 cc, you can go back to Sahelanthropus, who's about 320, so a bit, 25% larger than a chimp, but still relatively small in human terms. But this is probably a very, very critical link in the human family. Named for Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, yes, the old Beatles, which was playing when Donald Johanson found the skeleton. About the same time, we also found the famous Lake Tolly footprints. As if anyone doubted that she, or a Praeanthropus, was upright walking, they found direct trace fossil evidence. Because there were at that time ash beds being deposited and cemented very early because, well, they just stick together well when they get wet. And here you can see a trackway, I think 3.8, I can't quite remember the date, but it is quite ancient trackway, older than 3 million years, that shows this upright walking primate. It's attributed to Praeanthropus afarensis, in other words, Lucy. And then, of course, the more successful lineage coming off during the Neogene was the Australopithecus proper. Africanus was a major part of this. And of course, there was the very robust nutcracker man, which had extremely tough molar-form teeth for crunching seeds and so on. That was a little side shoot. Australopithecus africanus is probably pretty close to the origin of Homo, but exactly which branch is unclear. I love that picture. That'll spoil your whole day. This was a pretty successful organism, pretty human-like, and lasting about 2.2 to about 1.2 million years, about a million years run. That's a pretty good run. Okay, that's a little bit about Neogene life. We'll come back to the human story in a few minutes, but we now need to wrap the final chapter. And the final period that's put into the Earth's record was established way back when. Quaternary was a product of an ill-conceived idea about the first, second, and third, and fourth ages of the Earth. But anyway, de Noyers, this famous map maker, was the guy who proposed it. And he proposed it because he saw these big old boulders in Europe, and these big old boulders represented, we now know, glacial deposits, but he thought they were the mark of a great flood. So it was called the Diluvial Age, originally the age of flooding. Okay, we know now that glaciation actually started maybe even in the Oligocene. There were some glaciers, but certainly by Miocene and Pliocene. There were small glaciers. But there was a general climatic cooling down. Oops, sorry. Okay, I don't show de Noyer, but I do show Charles Lyell, and Charles Lyell gave rise to the name Pleistocene, most recent. The only thing more recent than that was called wholly recent, the Holocene, which was added on later. This is an incorrect date now. This should be 2.6, but that was changed just in the last decade. At the same time, a bunch of glacial geologists got after the global community that decides on naming of geologic periods. They said, no, we will not be subsumed within the Neogene. Everyone wanted it just to be the last epoch of the Neogene, but they said, no. Quaternary is special, Ice Age, and they got to keep it. In fact, there was a huge embargo on doing anything else. I was in the Devonian, Silurian, and Ordovician subcommissions. We were not allowed any money until this question was resolved, stupidly enough, and this means that we now have, again, Quaternary. We don't really use tertiary very much anymore. We use Paleogene, Neogene, but Quaternary stopped. And Lyell, of course, was basing his idea of Pleistocene on the fact that, more than 50%, I don't remember, maybe more than 75% of the species there you can find still alive today. Well, there it is. The Quaternary is not just the end of Neogene anymore. It's now its own period again. And it goes back about 2.6. I don't know where you want to say it ends. That's a really good question. But I guess now, we probably still, in a way, we live in the Quaternary, regardless of what we call the very last epoch, which has always been policy. Yeah, I think I've already summarized pretty much what is going on out here. We have a big transform fault. The whole American West was uplifted. There was major rifting in the Basin Range. Volcanism continued in the Cascades to the north. And the last dying, well, maybe not dying out, but the last part of the Yellowstone Snake River Plains hotspot came to rest at Yellowstone. Of course, where it's still there is a potential festering cauldron underneath the Earth. And the Earth looks very modern. This is 18,000 years ago at the so-called last glacial maximum. The thing about the Quaternary, of course, is climate. It's a climatic cooling down, and still further chilling, and expansion of ice, not just once, but probably initially many times, because back more than 800,000 years ago, the primary beat that the ice was moving to was a 40,000-year obliquity. As glaciers got still larger, there seemed to be some kind of time lag effect, so that the 100,000-year eccentricity cycle seems to take over. But gosh, there have been plenty, well, at least 8 since about 800,000 years ago, major glaciers going to this beat. And you can see it in many records. In the marine record, you see it going back. This is Del 018, okay? The oxygen isotope ratio is not only sensitive to temperature, it's especially sensitive to changes in glaciers. The more glaciers build up, the heavier the isotope becomes. You can see +2 here. And when they melt, they release all that lightweight water to the, which is O16 rich. Then it goes back abruptly, and you see, wow, an abrupt warming, an abrupt change to more negative values of Del 018. That pattern you see is not really symmetrical, but you can really see 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. That's operating to a nice Milankovitch eccentricity beat. And even still, you see within it these little subdivisions of glaciers that are called stadials. These are glacial ages, or glaciers and interglacials. But you see these are probably 20,000-year precessional cycles. And it goes into the record. You can see it if you dissolve forms. It means that we think of just maybe 1 or 2 glaciations in our local area, the Illinoisan and the Wisconsin were the last 2 that are often named, but Wisconsin particularly was the last one. But there were probably many more. The thing about glaciers is they tend to erase their own record. And if you look at the marine record there, you can just see it. Very beautifully tied to Milankovitch cyclicity. It's really just, it gives us good confidence that this is a cause of glacial and interglacial cycles. But what caused the bigger, stronger cooling? We know if you go back to Eocene time, the detachment of Australia from Antarctica began the circumantarctic current. This began a global chilling, and the first ice in Antarctica was probably in the Oligocene, late Paleogene time. But this was a great expansion. In the later Pliocene and Pleistocene, what happened? Well, what happened may be the same thing that happened to mammals, the connection of the corridor of the Isthmus of Panama. This allowed the Great American Interchange, and also meant that warm currents that flowed originally right through here were stopped, and they were sent northward along the Gulf Stream. And according to one model, at least, this changes the whole dynamics of ocean circulation. Among other things, it brings warm water to higher latitudes where you have an abundant then source of evaporation and moisture, which can nourish glaciers building up in the northern hemisphere. So perhaps it is the readjustment of these currents that may it. Okay, and of course during the last glacial maximums, or in 20 to 18,000 years ago, you have ice extending all the way down to the Ohio River Valley, and indeed the Ohio River owes its existence to glaciers which blockaded the original flow and caused a new rerouted drainage. So you can see a major part of the Canadian Shield, almost all the Canadian Shield in Greenland, and some parts of the United States were covered. And this is simply showing the recession starting at the last glacial maximum. These are sites of, human artifacts and stuff found. But anyway, you can see this going receding through this last section. Only Greenland left now with a remnant glacier. If you go back 18,000 years ago, that's quite expansive. And of course, it was responsible for digging out the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes were river valleys, but the various glaciers sculptured out the soft shales that existed in, for example, the Queenston Shale in the Ontario Basin, and they carved much broader basins that are filled with freshwater lakes now. Okay, well, I have another one. I think some pictures. I skipped all mine. There's some Neogene cartoons just for fun. Yeah, frogs evolving directly to humans. Not true. Oh, frogs. That's a funny thing. That's not that. And here you see the South American and Australian mammals evolved in isolation. That's a real weird one. I wish we're still around today, but it's not. It made it almost to the Pleistocene. It made it into the Pleistocene, and so did these guys. But they're gone now too. I mean, think about that. Certainly. Those are gone too. Those horned rodents. Well, ladies. So into the Pleistocene, you see a lot of glacial activity everywhere. Out west, you see it manifested as glacial sculpturing by mountain glaciers. Where you didn't have continental glaciers out in the Rockies, there you do see mountain glaciers. And they cut these magnificent peaks like the famous peaks of the famed Tetons, the Tetons, strange French name, which I mentioned on Monday where that came from, if you're interested. But it actually is classic glacial erosion of these little spiral pinnacles. Again, the glacial maximum showing all the way down here, but it was probably one of many. The last one, 19 or 18,000 years ago, was just the last one. It's the Wisconsin, or Wisconsin, by some people. And what does that do? Well, it creates erosion in these places. And of course, you'll have these various processes, and you can learn a huge amount in this department. The one reason I don't mind so much that I short sheet, and no doubt I short sheet the Pleistocene, because you can take whole courses on Pleistocene and Quaternary geology in this department and learn more if you like. But glaciers, as you know, are both agents of erosion and of deposition. They erode bedrock, they scour it up, and produce a major erosive valleys in some places, usually U-shaped compared with river valleys, which are V-shaped. And then, of course, there's a lot of material carried in the ice, gets deposited. When the ice recedes, you are left with moraines, with eskers, which are tubes under the ice filled with sand. Out in front, you've got an outwash plain, and of course, blocks of glacial ice there. And then those lead to pebble lakes. Huge boulders. This is what denoyers were so enthralled by. Originally, we called this the diluvial period. Yes, the boulders produced by. And glacial stride. The best stride, by the way, I'm sorry I don't have a picture, are on Kelly's Island on Lake Erie in Ohio. They're really spectacular glacial striations. Glacial tills spread over the landscape, much of northern Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, all covered with glacial till. You don't get to see bedrock. I rue the day that happened, but anyway, you do see a lot of glacial landforms, and it's pretty good soil, actually, for growing crops. You see our local resources of glacial deposits include the Miami River region, where you get these gravel pits and sand pits. One of Hamilton County's big resources is coming out of these outwash gravel. You see the beautiful climbing ripples in a sand pit here, and a channel that's matter. And of course, you also see glacial lake deposits near, right down in the valley of Mill Creek, just below us. You can see these beautiful varved sediments with occasional drop stones that were laid out in lakes that were dammed by the ice on one side, in some cases, and had these nice seasonal shifts. Okay, shut down. Yeah, we can get a sense of how thick the ice was from monadnocks. Monadnocks are peaks that stick out of the ice. This is in Antarctica. But we know from New England, from Mount Monadnock itself, which is the original name bearer for that, I don't know if it matters if you spell it, but this was an area, this is of course Antarctica, but we know that in the Pleistocene, the tip of that mountain just stuck up out of the ice. And so you can get a sense that the thickness of ice in places was greater than a mile thick.